She escaped from an ex-husband who nearly killed her, but the past returned in flames, literally. An innocent girl, a burned house, and a millionaire with dangerous secrets. But what he does when he discovers who she really is will leave you breathless. Watch this story until the end. You'll be surprised by this story. If you like love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel. We post videos like this every day, continuing. The cold May wind cut through the streets of Pinecrest like a whispering blade, carrying with it the sweet aroma of pine trees and the promise of rain. Autumn Reynolds walked along Maple Avenue with hurried steps, hugging her books against her chest as if they were a shield against the world. At 18, she carried on her shoulders the silent weight of a home where words were measured, and love was a luxury the family couldn't afford to show in excess. Her mother, Catherine, worked double shifts as a nurse at the municipal hospital and as a private caregiver on weekends. Her father had left when Autumn turned 10, leaving behind only the echo of unfulfilled promises and an emotional debt that the girl never managed to settle with herself. Since then, she had become the exemplary daughter, the dedicated student, the young woman who attended church every Sunday and carried in her eyes a purity that seemed to defy the harshness of the world around her. Catherine always said that Autumn was different from other girls. There wasn't in her the rush to grow up, the anxiety to experience what she didn't know. There was instead an unshakable faith in goodness, a belief that true love would come at the right time, with the right person, in the right way. Autumn believed in sacred first times, in respectful touches, in gazes that promised eternity without rushing to consummate. That's how, at 17, she gave her heart to Jason Fisher. He was 2 years older, the son of local merchants, a business administration student at the college in the neighboring town. He had an easy smile and the right words, knew how to make Autumn blush with compliments about her intelligence and her simple beauty. Jason attended the same church, knew her family, seemed to be exactly what a concerned mother would want for her daughter. For months, they dated under Catherine's approving gaze. Jason took Autumn for walks through the historics, downtown, for ice cream in the square, for movie sessions on Saturday afternoons. He held her hand with delicacy, kissed her lips with restraint, respected her boundaries with a patience that she interpreted as true love. But behind the sweet mask that Jason wore was something that Autumn couldn't see. He was a young man shaped by a sick vanity, by a constant need to prove his superiority over others. At college, he boasted about dating the purest girl in town, as if Autumn were a trophy to be displayed. He told his friends about her virginity with a mixture of pride and contempt, as if she were simultaneously an achievement and a burden. Jason had grown up in a family where money spoke louder than feelings, where appearances mattered more than truth. His father, owner of a chain of department stores, had always told him that everything in life had a price, including love. Jason had internalized this lesson in a distorted way, developing a cruel need to dominate what he didn't understand. Autumn's purity fascinated and irritated him at the same time. He wanted to be the first to possess her, but also felt a sadistic pleasure in imagining ways to humiliate her, to prove that she wasn't as special as everyone thought. There was in him a darkness that grew silently, fed by the envy he felt for the other college boys, who bragged about their sexual conquests while he remained stuck in a respectful relationship. Jason's transformation began subtly. He started making comments about Autumn's clothes, suggesting that she was old-fashioned or childish. He criticized her naivety, said she needed to grow up and see the world as it really was. Autumn, in her innocence, interpreted these words as loving advice from someone who cared about her personal growth. Catherine, who worked more and more to keep the house running, began to notice subtle changes in her daughter's behavior. Autumn was quieter, more introverted, spent long periods looking out the window with a distant expression. When questioned, the girl always answered that everything was fine, that it was just fatigue from her studies. The truth was that Autumn had begun to question her own purity. Jason had planted seeds of doubt in her mind, making her believe that there was something wrong with her, that her innocence was a flaw to be corrected. He talked about love differently now, with an intensity that frightened and attracted her at the same time. He said he wanted to show her what true love was, that she needed to trust him completely. It was on a Sunday afternoon after church service that Jason made the proposal that would change everything. They were walking along the trail that led to the forest preserve when he stopped and held her hands with a seriousness that Autumn had never seen before. "Autumn," he said, looking deeply into her eyes, "I love you more than anything in this world, and I want you to know that I trust you completely, but I need to know if you trust me in the same way." Autumn felt her heart race. There was something in his voice, an urgency that made her tremble. "Of course I trust you, Jason, you know that." "Then come with me," he said, pointing to a less-known trail that got lost among the pine trees. "I want to show you a special place, a place where I can show you what it means to truly love someone." Autumn hesitated for a moment. There was something in the proposal that made her uncomfortable, but Jason had been her first love, her first kiss, the first person who made her feel special. He knew her family, was respected at church, seemed to be exactly what a girl like her should desire. "All right," she finally said, allowing him to guide her down the unknown trail. They walked in silence for almost an hour, going deeper and deeper into the forest. Autumn began to feel a growing anxiety. The trail was steep and little used, and Jason seemed to know it too well for someone who claimed to have discovered it recently. When she tried to ask questions, he responded evasively, saying that soon she would understand everything. The clearing appeared like an apparition. It was a circular space in the middle of the woods, dominated by an old and twisted pine tree that stood like a solitary guardian. The place had something supernatural about it, something sacred but also threatening. Autumn felt a shiver run down her spine. "It's here," Jason said, his voice sounding strange, different. "This is the place where I'm going to show you who you really are." Autumn looked around, confused. "I don't understand, Jason. What do you mean?" That's when she saw it. On the ground, at the foot of the tree, there were red ribbons scattered, as if someone had prepared that location for some kind of ritual. Jason had an expression that she had never seen before, a mixture of excitement and coldness that made her take a step back. "Jason, I want to leave," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't like this place." "But we just arrived," he replied, approaching her with calculated steps. "And I haven't shown you what I came to show you yet." Autumn tried to move away, but Jason was faster. He grabbed her by the arms with a strength that she didn't know he possessed, his fingers leaving marks on her delicate skin. "You've always been so proper, so pure," he said, his voice loaded with cruel sarcasm. "Always thinking you're better than everyone else. But I'm going to show you who you really are beneath that saintly mask." Autumn tried to struggle, but Jason was stronger. He pushed her against the tree, took the red ribbons from the ground, and began to tie them around her wrists, binding them behind the trunk. It wasn't explicit physical violence, but something much worse. It was the complete violation of her trust, the destruction of everything she believed about love and respect. "Jason, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand what's happening. Why are you doing this?" "Because you need to learn," he replied, taking a step back to admire his work. "You need to learn that you're not special, that you're not different from the others. You're just another naive girl who believed in fairy tales." Autumn stayed there, tied to the tree, while Jason walked in circles around her, talking about how she was too good for the world, how her purity was a lie, how she needed to be broken to become a real woman. He didn't touch her in a sexual way, but his words were like knives cutting into her soul, destroying every piece of her self-esteem. The humiliation lasted for hours. Jason alternated between moments of apparent affection, where he caressed her face and said he loved her, and explosions of cruelty, where he shouted that she was a fake, that her innocence was just disguised ignorance. Autumn stopped crying. After a while, entering a state of shock that protected her from the emotional pain that had become unbearable. When the sun began to set, Jason finally tired of his cruel game. He approached her one last time, untied the ribbons that bound her, and let her fall to the ground like a broken doll. "Now you know who you really are," he said, putting the ribbons in his pocket as if they were trophies. "You can go home. But remember, if you tell anyone about today, I'll say that you seduced me, that you brought me here. Who believes in you will believe in me." And then he was gone, leaving Autumn alone in the clearing, surrounded by the growing darkness of the forest and the crushing weight of her lost innocence. She stayed there for a long time, unable to move, unable to process what had happened. Her mind was blank, as if it had switched off to protect her from a pain too great to be endured. It was the sound of approaching footsteps that finally brought her back to reality. Autumn raised her head, afraid that Jason had returned, but the figure that emerged from the woods was completely different. It was an older man, tall and elegant, with graying hair and eyes of a deep blue that seemed to carry the weight of many storms. Edward Blackwood wasn't looking for anyone when he found her. He had gone out for one of his solitary walks through the forest, a routine he had maintained for years as a way to escape from the ghosts that haunted his mansion. But upon seeing that young woman fallen at the foot of the tree, something in his chest contracted with a pain he hadn't felt in a long time. "My child," he said in a soft voice, kneeling beside her. "What happened here?" Autumn looked at him with empty eyes, unable to formulate a response. Edward saw the red marks on her wrists, noticed the state of shock she was in, and immediately understood that he had witnessed the consequences of something terrible. "Are you hurt?" he asked, examining her carefully. "Do you need medical help?" Autumn shook her head almost imperceptibly. There were no visible physical injuries, but Edward could see that there was something much deeper broken in her. "I'll take you home," he said, taking off his coat and placing it over her shoulders. "Can you tell me where you live?" Autumn murmured the address in an almost inaudible voice. Edward helped her to her feet, noticing how she trembled not just from cold, but from some kind of trauma that he recognized very well. He himself had been in that place of absolute emptiness, of pain so great that the mind simply refused to process it. As they slowly walked along the trail, Edward observed the young woman at his side. There was something about her that touched him in an unexpected way, a fragility that awakened his protective instincts that he thought he had buried along with his wife and daughter. Autumn walked like a ghost, physically present but absent in all other aspects. When they reached Autumn's house, a simple but well-maintained construction in a middle-class neighborhood, Edward hesitated. He could simply leave her at the door and go away, return to his life as a recluse, to his wines and his books. But something prevented him from leaving. Catherine opened the door and immediately noticed the state of her daughter. Her eyes filled with tears as she saw Autumn that way, and she hugged the girl with a desperation that Edward recognized as that of a mother who knows something terrible has happened, but doesn't know exactly what. "I found her in the forest," Edward explained simply without going into details. "She needs care." Catherine looked at him with gratitude and suspicion at the same time. Edward could see the questions in her eyes, but he could also see that she was more concerned with her daughter's well-being than with the circumstances of how she had arrived there. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you very much for bringing her home." Edward nodded and turned to leave, but something made him stop. He turned back to Catherine, took a card from his pocket, and handed it to her. "If she needs anything," he said, "anything at all, you can call me." And then he was gone, leaving behind a broken Autumn and a desperate mother, but also a seed of hope that none of the three yet fully understood. That night, Autumn remained in total silence. Catherine tried to make her eat, talk, react in some way, but the girl seemed to have withdrawn to some place very deep within herself. She bathed, put on her pajamas, and lay down in bed. But her eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, as if she were processing something that couldn't be put into words. Catherine stayed awake all night, watching her daughter, praying silently for a strength she didn't know if she possessed. She knew that something had broken in Autumn, something fundamental and precious, but she didn't know how to fix it. And a few miles away, Edward Blackwood also remained awake, looking out the window of his lonely mansion, thinking about the young woman he had found in the forest. There was something about her that reminded him of himself, of how he had felt when he lost everything he loved. But there was also something more, something he couldn't name, a light that persisted even in the deepest darkness. He didn't yet know that that fortuitous encounter would change not only Autumn's life, but also his own, in a way he had never imagined possible. Edward Blackwood woke up the next morning with the image of Autumn etched in his mind. For 15 years, since the death of Helen and little Isabella, he had locked himself in his own life like a secular monk, living among the vines of the property inherited from his family and the books that lined the walls of his library. Blackwood Vineyards was one of the most respected in the country, but Edward had long since left the administration in the hands of competent managers, preferring to dedicate himself only to the creation of his special wines, those that are born from solitude and time. His routine had been unchangeable for years. He woke up before dawn, walked through the vineyards checking each vine with the care of someone looking after children, had lunch alone in his empty dining room, spent the afternoons reading or tasting his own wines, and ended the day walking through the forest that surrounded his property. It was a life meticulously organized to avoid surprises, to leave no space for the pain that still throbbed in his chest like a poorly healed wound. Helen had been his wife for 16 years, a woman with an easy laugh and a generous heart, who had transformed his life as a lonely heir into something close to complete happiness. Isabella, his daughter, had inherited her mother's laugh and her father's blue eyes, and at 8 years old already showed a lively intelligence that filled Edward with pride. They were his reason for existing, the center around which his entire life gravitated. The accident happened on an autumn afternoon. Helen was returning from school with Isabella when a drunk driver ran a red light and collided with their car. Both died instantly, leaving Edward alone with a void that no amount of money or professional success could fill. For months he had tried to kill himself slowly, drowning in drink and neglecting everything around him, until one morning he woke up and decided that if he couldn't die, at least he could stop living. Since then, he had transformed into the ghost of himself, a respected but distant figure in local society. People knew him as the rich widower who had lost his family, the man who had once been charismatic and engaging, but now preferred the solitude of his mansion to social interactions. He wasn't cruel or bitter, just absent, as if part of his soul had departed along with Helen and Isabella. But something had changed when he found Autumn in the forest. There was something about the way she had looked at him, not with fear or distrust, but with a vulnerability that mirrored his own, that had touched him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Throughout that night, he had caught himself thinking about her, about the pain he had seen in her eyes, about the way she had trembled when he had placed his coat over her shoulders. Edward tried to ignore these thoughts, immersing himself in his morning routine with redoubled determination. But when he reached the wine cellar to check the wines that were in the process of maturing, he found himself unable to concentrate. His hands trembled slightly as he tasted a 5-year-old Cabernet Sauvignon, and he realized that he was thinking about how Autumn's eyes seemed to carry all the sadness of the world. It was then that she appeared. Edward was leaving the wine cellar when he saw a familiar figure walking along the dirt road that led to his property. It was Autumn, wearing a simple blue cotton dress, her brown hair tied in a loose ponytail. She walked slowly, as if each step were an effort, but there was a determination in her posture that hadn't been present the night before. Edward felt his heart race in a way that hadn't happened in years. He approached her, noticing how she stopped now and then to look at the vines that extended in perfectly aligned rows as far as the eye could see. "Autumn," he said softly, making her turn. "What brings you here?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed to have cried all night, but there was something different in them now, a clarity that didn't exist before. "I came to thank you," she said, her voice still fragile but firmer than the night before, "for what you did yesterday, and also because I have no one else to talk to." Edward felt something tighten in his chest. There was a loneliness in her voice that he intimately recognized, a pain that spoke directly to his own experience of loss. "You don't need to thank me," he said, gesturing for her to accompany him to the porch of the main house. "And you can. Talk to me whenever you want." They sat in wicker chairs under the shade of an old vine, and for a long moment they remained silent. Edward observed Autumn discreetly, noticing how she seemed diminished, as if something fundamental had been taken from her. He recognized that sensation, that emptiness that seemed to suck all the vital energy from a person. He said, "I'm not special," Autumn said suddenly, her voice almost a whisper, "that my purity was just ignorance." Edward felt a sudden and intense anger rise in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. There was something about the way she spoke, the raw pain in her voice, that awakened in him a protective instinct he thought he had lost forever. "Who said that?" he asked, his voice more severe than he intended. Autumn lowered her eyes, the tears beginning to form again. "Someone I trusted. Someone I loved." Edward understood immediately. He had seen the marks on her wrists the night before, had recognized the signs of someone who had been betrayed in the worst possible way. His experience with pain gave him an insight that others did not possess. "Autumn," he said, his voice becoming gentle again, "can I tell you something I learned from my own pain?" She raised her eyes to him, waiting. "When we lose something precious, when someone hurts us deeply, it's easy to start believing that we deserve that pain, that there's something wrong with us. But the truth is that the cruelty of others doesn't define who we are. It only reveals who they are." Autumn looked at him with an intensity that surprised him. "How can you be so sure?" "Because I've also been in the place where you are now," Edward replied, his voice loaded with an honesty that surprised him. "I've also believed that I deserved the pain I was feeling." For a moment they just looked at each other, two wounded souls recognizing each other. Edward felt something move in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name, a connection that transcended the circumstances of how they met. "Can I tell you a story?" he asked softly. Autumn nodded, and Edward began to talk about Helen and Isabella, about how it had been to love them and lose them, about how the pain had almost destroyed him. He talked about the guilt he carried, about how he felt responsible for not having been able to protect them, about how he had spent years punishing himself for something that was beyond his control. Autumn listened to him with an attention he didn't expect from someone so young, asking intelligent questions, offering insights that revealed an emotional maturity that contrasted with her apparent fragility. There was something about her that made him want to keep talking, to share things he had never told anyone. "What hurts me the most," he said at one point, "is knowing that I was trying to protect them from all the evil in the world, but the evil came anyway, and I couldn't do anything." "But you did do something," Autumn said softly. "You saved me yesterday, and not because you had to, but because you wanted to." Edward looked at her, surprised by the profound simplicity of her words. There was something about her, a wisdom that seemed to come from a place much deeper than her age suggested, that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, Autumn telling about her life with Catherine, about the dreams she had had before meeting Jason, about the faith that now seemed shaken. Edward talked about his wines, about how the fermentation process was a metaphor for life, about how some of the best things were born from the worst circumstances. When the sun began to set, Autumn stood up to leave. Edward accompanied her to the entrance of the property, feeling a strange reluctance to see her go. "Autumn," he said when she was already on the road, "you can come back whenever you want, not just when you need help, but when you want to talk." She turned and smiled at him, the first genuine smile he had seen on her face. It was a small smile, still wounded, but there was a light in it that made Edward's heart leap. "Thank you, Edward," she said, using his name for the first time. "I think I will come back." And then she was gone, leaving Edward alone with a feeling he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the feeling that perhaps, just maybe, he wasn't condemned to live the rest of his life alone. That night, as he tasted a red wine on the porch of his house, Edward found himself thinking about Autumn in a way that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't sexual desire. She was too young, too wounded, and he wasn't the type of man who would take advantage of such a situation. It was something deeper, more complex, a connection that seemed to transcend age, circumstances, everything that should make any kind of relationship between them unlikely. He tried to rationalize his feelings, to convince himself that it was just compassion, just the protective instinct of an older man for a young woman in suffering. But there was something more, something that made him remember how he had felt when he met Helen, that sensation of recognizing something familiar in a new face. Edward shook his head, trying to push away these thoughts. Autumn was wounded. She needed healing, not complications. And he was a 53-year-old man, carrying the ghosts of a marriage that had been his only experience of true love. What kind of man would he be if he took advantage of her vulnerability? But even as he tried to convince himself that his feelings were inappropriate, Edward couldn't deny that something had changed in him since he found Autumn in the forest. For the first time in 15 years, he felt that there was something worth living for in his life, someone who made him want to wake up the next day. And meanwhile, a few miles away, Autumn also remained awake, thinking about the man who had saved her not only physically, but somehow also emotionally. There was something about Edward that made her feel safe, protected, but also awake in a new way. He looked at her as if she were precious, as if she were worth protecting, and that was something she had never experienced before. Autumn knew, she was young, that perhaps she didn't fully understand what she was feeling, but she also knew that Edward was different from any man she had ever met, and that there was something between them that transcended the circumstances of how they, till the days that followed, created an unexpected routine. Autumn visited Edward every afternoon, always at the same time, always with the same silent determination. Catherine had initially hesitated about these visits, but when she saw how her daughter was gradually recovering something of her inner light, she decided to trust the maternal instinct that told her Edward was a good man. Edward, in turn, discovered that he awaited these visits with an anxiety he hadn't felt in years. He found himself planning things to show Autumn, wines for her to taste, stories to tell. For the first time in 15 years, the days had a purpose beyond mere survival. Autumn possessed a natural curiosity that Edward found refreshing. She asked questions about the wines that revealed a genuine thirst for knowledge, and he found himself explaining not only the technical processes, but also the philosophy behind each choice. There was something in the way she listened to him, as if each word were precious, that awakened in him a desire to open up that he hadn't felt in years. But what neither of them knew was that Jason Fisher hadn't disappeared from their lives. He watched, waited, planned. Edward's presence in Autumn's life had only intensified his obsession with her, transforming him into something much more dangerous. The following days unfolded with the smoothness of wine maturing slowly. Autumn began to visit Edward with a regularity that surprised them both. She always arrived at the end of the afternoon, when the golden light of sunset painted the vines with shades of gold and crimson, and stayed until twilight, talking with him about everything and about nothing. Edward discovered that Autumn possessed a curious intelligence and a sensitivity that contrasted with her limited life experience. She asked questions about the wines that revealed a genuine thirst for knowledge, and he found himself explaining not only the technical processes, but also the philosophy behind each choice, each decision that transformed simple grapes into something transcendent. "Wine is a metaphor for life," he said one afternoon, holding a glass of Merlot against the sunlight. "It needs the darkness of fermentation, the pressure, sometimes even pain, to become something special." Autumn observed him with an attention that made him uncomfortable and gratified at the same time. There was something in the way she listened to him, as if each of his words were precious, that awakened in him a desire to open up that he hadn't felt in years. "Do you think pain is always worth it?" she asked, her voice loaded with a melancholy that still hadn't completely left her. "Eyes?" Edward put the glass on the table and looked at her directly. "No," he said with brutal honesty. "Not always. Sometimes pain just breaks us, leaves us smaller than we were before. But when we manage to survive it, when we manage to transform it into something useful, then it teaches us things we would never learn otherwise." Autumn nodded slowly, as if she were processing his words. "Jason said I needed to be broken to become a real woman." The mention of the name made Edward involuntarily clench his fists. He still didn't know exactly what had happened between Autumn and this Jason, but each fragment she revealed painted an increasingly dark picture. Men who say things like that, Edward said carefully, are usually revealing more about themselves than about you. A man who truly loves never wants to break the person he loves. He wants to protect her, take care of her, see her flourish. Autumn looked at him with an intensity that made him feel exposed. Is that how you loved your wife? The question caught him off guard. Edward remained silent for a long moment, remembering Helen, how she laughed when he tried to explain the nuances of a wine, how she made him feel like the best version of himself. Yes, he finally said. Helen made me want to be a better man, and I wanted to do the same for her. She was lucky, Autumn said softly. No, Edward replied, his voice becoming hoarse. I was the lucky one, and then I lost everything. Autumn leaned forward, and for a moment Edward thought she was going to touch his hand, but she stopped as if remembering some invisible barrier between them. Maybe you haven't lost everything, she said. Maybe you've just lost that life. Maybe there are still other possible lives. There was something in the way she spoke, a wisdom that seemed to come from a place much deeper than her age, that made Edward question everything he had assumed about his own existence. Autumn's visits became the highlight of Edward's days. He found himself waking up with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years, planning things to show her, wines for her to taste, stories to tell. Catherine had initially hesitated about these visits, but when she saw how her daughter was gradually recovering something of her inner light, she decided to trust the maternal instinct that told her Edward was a good man. She's better, Catherine said one night, when Edward brought her home after one of the visits. More like the girl she was, before whatever happened. Edward nodded, but didn't say that Autumn was also changing him, that for the first time in 15 years he felt that there was a purpose in his life beyond simple survival. It was on a Thursday that everything started to get complicated. Autumn was in the wine cellar with Edward, observing him checking the barrels where his special wines were aging, when they heard the sound of a car approaching. Edward frowned. He wasn't expecting visitors, and few people came to his property without notice. They left the wine cellar to find a tall, dark-haired young man getting out of a black Honda Civic. Edward immediately knew who he was, by the way. Autumn paled and took a step back, instinctively seeking the protection of his presence. Jason Fisher was exactly the type of young man Edward had imagined, handsome in a conventional way, well-dressed, with the kind of arrogant confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for his actions. He smiled when he saw Autumn, but there was something predatory in that smile that made Edward discreetly place himself between them. Autumn, Jason said, his voice loaded with an intimacy that made Edward want to punch him. I finally found you don't answer my calls. I don't want to talk to you, Autumn said, her voice trembling but firm. Jason laughed as if she had made a joke. Of course you do, we're dating, remember. I was just testing you to see if you really loved me. Edward felt such intense anger that for a moment he was afraid of himself. He stepped forward, placing himself completely between Jason and Autumn. She said she doesn't want to talk to you, Edward said, his voice low and dangerous. I think you'd better leave. Jason looked him up and down, evaluating. Edward was taller and obviously stronger, but Jason had the arrogance of youth and the certainty of someone who always got what he wanted. And who are you? Jason asked, his tone becoming challenging. What is a man of your age doing with my girlfriend? She's not your girlfriend, Edward said, each word loaded with contained threat, and what I'm doing is protecting her from you. Jason laughed again, but there was something forced in the sound. Protecting her from me. Man, you have no idea what you're talking about. Autumn and I have history, we have intimacy, and you're just a lonely old man who's taking advantage of a confused girl. Edward felt something break inside him. Before he could control himself, he had grabbed Jason by the shirt and pushed him against the car. Listen carefully, kid, he said, his voice a deadly whisper. I saw what you did to her. I saw the marks you left. And if you come near her again, I'll take great pleasure in showing you what a real man does with someone who hurts innocent people. Jason tried to free himself, but Edward was stronger. For a moment, Edward saw real fear in the young man's eyes and felt a dark satisfaction. "Edward, stop," Autumn said behind him, her voice frightened. "Please." Edward released Jason, who stumbled backward, adjusting his shirt with trembling hands. But instead of leaving, Jason smiled again, and Edward realized he had made a mistake. "Interesting," Jason said, his voice regaining its arrogance. "Very interesting. Autumn, did you tell your protector about our special afternoon in the forest?" Autumn became even paler, and Edward understood that Jason was using some kind of information against her. "No," Jason continued, clearly enjoying the moment. "What a shame. Because I was thinking about telling some people about how I found you two here, a rich 50-year-old man and an 18-year-old girl. People will love this story." Edward felt his blood freeze. He immediately understood the implicit threat. Jason was suggesting something improper about his relationship with Autumn, something that could destroy the reputation of both. "You have nothing to tell," Edward said, but Jason just laughed. "No? An innocent girl just out of a traumatic relationship finds consolation in the arms of an older, rich man. The local newspapers will love it, and I imagine that the family company won't be very happy with the scandal." Autumn stepped forward, and Edward saw something change in her expression. The fragility was being replaced by a determination that he didn't know she possessed. "Jason," she said, her voice cutting like steel, "you're threatening a man who has never done anything but good to me, a man who saved me when you left me, tied in the forest like an animal." Jason blinked, clearly not expecting this reaction. "Autumn, you're confused. You know that what happened between us was... It was you humiliating me because you can't deal with the fact that there are better people than you in the world," Autumn interrupted him. "It was you hurting me because you're too small to truly love someone." Edward looked at Autumn with a mixture of pride and concern. She was finding her strength, but Jason was unpredictable, and men like him could be dangerous when confronted. Jason was silent for a moment, processing Autumn's words. When he spoke again, his voice had a coldness that Edward recognized as truly dangerous. "Very well," he said, "if that's how you want to play, Autumn. But remember, I know people in this town. I have friends in important places. And now I have a very interesting story about you and your mentor." He turned to Edward. "Enjoy while you can, old man, because I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." Jason got into the car and left, leaving behind only the sound of the engine and a sense of threat that hung in the air like toxic smoke. Autumn turned to Edward, tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I brought trouble to you." Edward pulled her into a hug, feeling how she fit perfectly against his chest. "You didn't bring trouble. You brought light to a life that had been dark for too long." But even as he consoled Autumn, Edward knew that Jason had changed everything. The threat was real. In a small town like Pine Crest, rumors could spread quickly and cause irreparable damage. He could handle attacks on his own reputation, but he couldn't allow Autumn to be dragged into a scandal because of him. "Autumn," he said softly, moving away to look into her eyes, "maybe it's better if you don't come here for a while. Until things calm down." Autumn looked at him with a pain that broke his heart. "You want me to go away?" "No," Edward said, the honesty escaping before he could control himself. "I don't want you to go away, but I need to protect you, and if that means staying away from me—" Autumn shook her head violently. "No, I already let Jason push me away from things I wanted. I won't let him do that again." Edward looked at her, seeing the determination in her eyes, the strength that was emerging from the wounded girl he had found in the forest. And at that moment, he understood that he was in love with her, not with the romantic idea of saving her, but with the brave woman she was becoming. It was an impossible love, inappropriate, that violated all the social rules he knew. But it was real, and it grew every day, and Edward knew that no matter what the consequences were, he couldn't simply let her go. That night, as Autumn returned home and Edward remained alone in his mansion, both knew that something had changed irrevocably. Jason had forced a decision they had been avoiding. Either they would face the world together, or they would be destroyed separately. Edward spent the night walking around his property, thinking about Jason's words, about the threat that hung over them. He knew well the power of rumors in small towns, knew how malice could spread like fire in dry brush, but he also knew that he couldn't simply abandon Autumn, not when she was finally regaining her strength. And somewhere in town, Jason Fisher was planning exactly how to turn his threat into reality, feeding an obsession that grew like a cancer in his chest, determined to destroy any happiness that Autumn might find away from him. The first time Edward truly felt the weight of his feelings for Autumn was on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after Jason's threatening visit. She arrived at the vineyard earlier than usual, carrying a wicker basket that exuded the aroma of fresh bread and freshly brewed coffee. "My mum made cornbread," she said, smiling with a shyness that made his heart race. "And I thought maybe you'd like to share breakfast with me." Edward watched her as she spread a checkered tablecloth under the shade of an old vine, carefully arranging the bread, the coffee still hot in a thermos, small jars of homemade jam. There was something domestic and intimate about that gesture that made him realize how empty his house had become in the last 15 years, how he had grown accustomed to solitary meals and silences that stretched for entire days. Autumn was wearing a simple yellow cotton dress that enhanced the golden color of her skin and made her brown eyes shine like honey under the sunlight. She had left her hair loose, and Edward caught himself imagining what it would be like to run his fingers through those silky strands, what it would be like to wake up every morning with that face on the pillow next to his. The thought frightened him with its intensity. Edward had loved Helen deeply, but that had been a love that had grown slowly, built on friendship and compatibility, matured over the years like a good wine. What he felt for Autumn was different, more urgent, more desperate, loaded with a need that he didn't know how to control. "Edward?" Her voice brought him back to the present. "Is everything okay?" He realized that he had been standing still, observing her, lost in his own thoughts. "Sorry, I was just admiring how beautiful you are." The words came out before he could control himself, and Autumn blushed in an adorable way that made Edward want to kiss her right there, under the morning sun, surrounded by the perfume of the ripe vines. "Edward," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" He nodded, sitting beside her on the tablecloth, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. "Have you ever thought about having a second chance with someone?" The question was asked with an innocence that didn't completely hide her deeper intention. Edward looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes, the courage she was showing by asking a question that could result in rejection. "Autumn," he began, his voice coming out more hoarse than he intended. "How you know that there's a significant age difference between us?" 35 years, she said simply. "I can count." Edward smiled despite himself. "You're 18 years old. Your whole life is ahead of you. You'll meet other men your age, who can offer you things that I can't." Autumn turned to face him completely. What things? Edward hesitated. How to explain that he was a man haunted by ghosts, carrying scars that might never completely heal? How to say that she deserved someone who could love her without reservations, without the weight of a previous loss? "Youth," he said finally. "Energy. The ability to grow with you, to discover life by your side instead of having already lived most of it." Autumn was silent for a moment, biting her lower lip in a way that made Edward have to look away to maintain his composure. "Can I tell you what Jason offered me?" she asked. "He was young, my age, full of energy, and he wanted to break me, diminish me, transform me into something I wasn't." Edward felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. "Autumn, you," she continued, "offer me respect, security, the feeling that I'm precious, that I'm worth protecting. You teach me things, treat me as if I were intelligent, as if my opinions mattered." Edward looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, feeling something move in his chest that was deeper than desire, stronger than passion. "I can't offer you the same dreams that a young man would offer," he said carefully. "I've already had my family, my children. You think I can't want a life different from what other women my age want? Autumn asked. You think we all dream of the same things? Edward was left without an answer. There was a wisdom in her, words that forced him to question his own assumptions about what a young woman should want from life. Autumn leaned in closer, and Edward could smell the sweet perfume of her hair, the warmth of her skin. Edward, can I tell you a secret? He nodded, not trusting his voice. I never wanted to be like the other girls my age. Never wanted parties, clubs, complicated dating. I always wanted peace, security, someone who would really see me, who would understand me. She paused, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I wanted someone like you. Edward felt something break and remake itself in his chest at the same time. He raised his hand slowly, touching her face with a delicacy that contradicted the intensity of his feelings. Autumn, he whispered, are you sure about what you're saying? I'm more sure of this than of anything in my life, she replied, covering his hand with hers. It was then that Edward kissed her for the first time. It was a soft kiss, respectful, loaded with all the tenderness he had repressed for weeks. Autumn responded with a sweetness that made Edward understand that he was irremediably lost, that any resistance he still maintained had completely dissolved. When they separated, Autumn smiled at him with a radiant happiness that made Edward feel 20 years younger. I love you, she said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Edward looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, feeling the weight and responsibility of those words. Autumn, I love you, too, but that doesn't make things simpler. In fact, it makes everything more complicated. Why? Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. Because now I have to protect not just you, but also our love, and there are people who will try to destroy both. As if his words were prophetic, they heard the sound of cars approaching. Edward stood up, helping Autumn to do the same, and saw 2 cars coming up the dirt road toward the house. His heart sank when he recognized one of the vehicles. It was Jason's black Honda Civic. The second car was a silver SUV that Edward didn't recognize, but when the vehicle stopped and the people got out, he immediately understood that Jason had fulfilled his threat. Jason got out of the first car, accompanied by an older man whom Edward recognized as his father, Robert Fisher, owner of the largest chain of department stores in the region. From the second car emerged an elegant woman with a professional camera and a middle-aged man with a recorder, clearly journalists. Autumn instinctively moved closer to Edward, who felt anger and fear fighting in his chest. He had underestimated Jason, thinking that the young man would limit himself to empty threats, but Jason had brought a committee, had transformed this into a public spectacle. Mr. Blackwood, Robert Fisher said, his voice loaded with an authority that came from years of building a commercial empire. I need to speak with you about your relationship with this underage girl. Edward felt the anger explode in his chest. Autumn is not underage. She's 18 years old. 18 years recently completed, Jason said, approaching with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And just out of a traumatic relationship, vulnerable, easily manipulated by an older man with money and influence. The woman with the camera began taking photos, while the man with the recorder approached. Mr. Blackwood, is it true that you have been maintaining an intimate relationship with Miss Autumn Reynolds? Edward put a protective arm around Autumn's shoulders, who was visibly shaken by the situation. I won't answer questions based on malicious insinuations. They're not insinuations, Jason said, his voice loaded with false concern. I saw the two of you together. I saw how he manipulates you, how he takes advantage of your vulnerability. Autumn, you need to understand that this man is taking advantage of you. Autumn moved slightly away from Edward and stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. Nobody is taking advantage of me. Edward saved me when you abandoned me in the forest. He treated me with more respect in a few weeks than you did in months of dating. Robert Fisher frowned. What's this story about a forest? Jason paled slightly, clearly not expecting Autumn to mention that episode. She's confused, traumatized. She doesn't know what she's saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Autumn replied, her voice gaining strength. I know that you took me to that clearing with the intention of humiliating me. I know that you tied me to that tree and left me there as if I were nothing. And I know that Edward found me and saved me, without asking for anything in return. The journalist moved closer, clearly interested in this new information. Miss, can you elaborate on this incident in the forest? Jason stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. She's lying. She's making up stories to protect her, to benefactor. I'm not lying, Autumn said, taking her cell phone from her pocket. And I can prove it. Edward looked at her, surprised. Autumn fiddled with the phone for a few seconds before showing the screen to everyone. It was a photo she had discreetly taken of the red ribbons that Jason had kept as trophies the last time he had tried to contact her. He sent me this, she said, her voice firm despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. As a reminder of what he called our special afternoon. The silence that followed was deafening. Robert Fisher looked at his son with an expression of growing horror, while the journalists exchanged significant looks. Jason, Robert said, his voice low and dangerous. What does this mean? Jason opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly in panic. Dad, I can explain. No, Robert interrupted him, turning to the journalists. This interview is over. My son has nothing more to say. But the damage was already done. The journalists had heard enough to understand that the real story was very different from what Jason had tried to sell. The vulnerable young woman who was supposedly being manipulated by an older man had revealed herself to be a survivor of emotional abuse, defending the man who had saved her. Miss Autumn, the journalist said softly, would you like to make an official statement about your relationship with Mr. Blackwood? Autumn looked at Edward, who nodded encouragingly. She took a deep breath and turned to face the cameras. Edward Blackwood is the most honorable man I've ever met, she said, her voice clear and firm. He saved me when I was at the worst moment of my life, treated me with respect and kindness, and never, not once, tried to take advantage of me in any way. If there's any scandal here, it's the fact that a young man like Jason Fisher can humiliate and mistreat a woman and then try to destroy the reputation of the man who helped her. Edward felt a wave of pride and love so intense that it almost knocked him down. Autumn had found her voice, her strength, and was using both to defend him with a courage that left him speechless. Jason tried to approach again, but Edward placed himself firmly between him and Autumn. I think we've heard enough, Edward said, his voice low but loaded with authority. I suggest that all of you leave my property. Now. Robert Fisher grabbed his son's arm and dragged him toward the car, muttering threats that Edward couldn't hear but could imagine. The journalists followed them, clearly satisfied with the much more interesting story they had discovered. When the cars disappeared down the road, Edward turned to Autumn, who was trembling slightly with the adrenaline of the confrontation. You two were amazing, he said, pulling her into his arms. Brave, intelligent, strong. I couldn't be more proud. Autumn nestled against his chest, breathing deeply. I couldn't let him destroy you, not after everything you've done for me. Edward moved her away slightly to look into her eyes. Autumn, do you understand what this means? What just happened will change everything. The story will spread, people. We'll talk. Let them talk, Autumn said with determination. For the first time in my life, I know exactly who I am and what I want. And what I want is you, Edward, no matter what others say. Edward kissed her again, but this time it was different. It was a kiss of promise, of commitment, of two hearts deciding to face the world together, no matter what the consequences were. They knew that the following days would be difficult, that there would be comments, judgments, perhaps even more, confrontations, but they also knew that they had found something precious in each other, something worth fighting to protect. As the sun set over the vines, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, Edward and Autumn remained embraced, knowing that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were now officially together against the entire world. The article came out in the local newspaper 3 days later, but it wasn't the story that Jason had planned. The headline read, "Young woman denounces emotional abuse and finds protection." in Local Businessman, and the article painted a completely different portrait from what everyone expected. Autumn was portrayed as a brave survivor, Edward as an honorable man who had offered support in a time of need, and Jason appeared as the true villain of the story. The impact was immediate and devastating for the Fisher family. Robert spent the following days trying to contain the damage to his business's reputation, while Jason hid from the public opinion that had turned against him. But for Edward and Autumn, the exposure brought an unexpected freedom. Now they could be together openly without hiding behind justifications or explanations. Edward found Autumn the morning after the article's publication, sitting on his favorite porch, reading the newspaper with a thoughtful expression. She was wearing a simple white dress that made her look like an ethereal apparition against the green background of the vines. "How do you feel?" he asked, sitting beside her. Autumn folded the newspaper and put it aside. "Strange," she admitted. "For years I lived trying to be invisible, trying not to attract attention. And now the whole town is talking about me." Edward touched her hand softly. "Do you regret it?" "No," she replied without hesitation. "Not for a second. But Edward, now that all of this is public, I need to ask you something." He waited, seeing the seriousness in her eyes. "Where do we go from here? What are we exactly?" The question that Edward had been avoiding for weeks. He knew that he couldn't continue treating his feelings for Autumn as a temporary anomaly, something that would pass with time. What he felt for her had become the driving force of his existence, more real and urgent than anything he had experienced since Helen's death. "I want you to come live with me," he said, the words coming out before he could censor them. Autumn looked at him surprised. "Edward, not in an improper way," he hastened to clarify, blushing. "You would have your own room, your own privacy. But I can't stand the idea of you going home every night anymore, of spending hours without knowing if you're well, if you're safe." Autumn was silent for a long moment, processing the proposal. "And my mother. Catherine is welcome whenever she wants to visit. In fact, I would like to talk to her, ask for her official permission to court you properly." The old-fashioned word made Autumn smile. "Court?" Edward smiled back, a little embarrassed. "I know it sounds antiquated, but Autumn, I want to do things right with you. I want everyone to know that my intentions are serious, that it's not a whim or an older man's fantasy. I want to build a life with you." Autumn stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking at the vines that extended to the horizon. Edward followed her, positioning himself behind her, close enough to feel the warmth of her skin but without touching her. "Are you sure that's what you want?" she asked without turning. "A life with me? Even knowing that I'll be learning to be an adult while you've already lived an entire life?" "Especially because of that," Edward replied. "Autumn, you've made me remember what it's like to feel hope, what it's like to have something worth waking up for every day. Yes, I've already lived a lot, but with you, I feel as if my real life is just beginning." Autumn turned to face him, and Edward saw tears of happiness shining in her eyes. "Then my answer is yes," she said, "to living here, to letting you court me properly, to building a life together. But there's one condition." Edward raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" "I want to continue studying. I want to graduate, maybe go to college. I don't want to be just Edward Blackwood's young wife. I want to be Autumn, the woman who chose to love Edward Blackwood." The word wife made Edward's heart leap, but he focused on the rest of the sentence. "Of course, in fact, I insist on it. You're too intelligent not to develop your full potential." Autumn smiled and approached him, placing her hands on his chest. "Then it's decided." Edward kissed her, a long and sweet kiss that sealed their agreement. When they separated, he held her face between his hands. "Autumn, I need you to understand something. The age difference between us will always exist. There will be moments when you'll feel too old for your age, and moments when I'll feel too young for mine. There will be people who will always question our relationship." "I know," she said simply, "and I don't care. And you need to know that I still carry scars from the loss of Helen and Isabella. Sometimes I'll be distant, melancholic. Sometimes I'll be afraid of loving you too much because I know what it's like to lose them. Autumn touched his face tenderly. And you need to know that I'm still healing from what Jason did to me. Sometimes I'll doubt myself, my worth, my capacity to be loved. Sometimes I'll need time and patience. Edward nodded. Then let's heal. Together. The conversation with Catherine happened that same afternoon. Edward had asked Autumn to invite her for dinner at the vineyard, and now the three of them were sitting in the mansion's dining room, surrounded by the golden glow of the candles that Autumn had insisted on lighting. Catherine had observed Edward during the entire meal, evaluating him with the perspicacious look of a mother who had raised her daughter alone. She saw how he treated Autumn with an almost reverential respect, how his eyes softened when he looked at her, how he made sure she was comfortable before worrying about his own well-being. "Mr. Blackwood," Catherine said when they finished eating, "Autumn told me about your proposal." Edward swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am, and I would like to ask for your blessing." Catherine leaned forward. "You're 53 years old. My daughter is 18. How can I be sure it's not just a middle-aged man's fantasy?" Edward had expected this question. "Because you raised an extraordinary daughter," he replied. "Autumn is not a fantasy for me. She is the most precious reality I've ever found. And if it's just a phase of my life, then I prefer to live the rest of my days in this phase. And if she gets tired of you, if she decides she wants to experience life with men her age?" Edward looked at Autumn, who was listening to the conversation with attention but without anxiety. "Then I'll let her go," he said simply. "Because loving someone means wanting the best for that person, even if the best doesn't include you." Catherine studied his face for a long moment. "And financially? How would that work?" "I'll sign a prenuptial agreement renouncing any right to any property or money of Edward's," Autumn said before he could respond. "I don't want anyone to think I'm with him out of interest." Edward turned to her, surprised. "Autumn, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do," she interrupted him. "For my own peace of mind. I want everyone to know, including myself, that I'm with you because I love you, not because you can offer me financial security." Catherine smiled for the first time that night. "That's my daughter," she said with pride, "always stubborn when it comes to doing the right thing." She stood up and walked to the window, looking at the vines illuminated by the moon. "Mr. Blackwood, can I ask you a personal question?" "Of course." "Do you still love your late wife?" Edward hesitated. It was a complex question, loaded with nuances that he himself was still trying to understand. "I will always love the memory of Helen," he said carefully. "She was a fundamental part of who I became. But what I feel for Autumn is different. It's new. It's a love that exists in the present, not in the past." Catherine turned to face him. "And can you live with that? With the fact that you will always be compared to a ghost?" "Mom," Autumn protested, but Edward raised his hand. "No, she's right to ask," he said. "Catherine, I can't promise that I'll never miss Helen, that I'll never have moments of melancholy or longing, but I can promise that that won't diminish what I feel for Autumn. The human heart is capable of loving in different ways, at different moments in life." Catherine nodded, slowly. "And Autumn, can you live with that? Can you love a man who carries other losses, other longings?" Autumn stood up and went to her mother. "Mum, we all carry our past. Edward carries the longing for a wife and daughter he loved. I carry the scars of what Jason did to me. But when we're together, somehow we carry these things less. We become stronger by each other's side." Catherine looked between the two, seeing something in the way they positioned themselves in relation to each other, a natural harmony that couldn't be faked. "Very well," she said finally. "You have my blessing, but with some conditions." Edward and Autumn waited. First, Autumn continues studying, college, graduate school, whatever she wants. Second, no marriage for at least a year. You need to live together, know each other's flaws. Be sure that this isn't just passion. Third, if at any point Autumn wants to come home for any reason, she is always welcome, without questions, without judgments. "I agree with everything," Edward said immediately. Autumn hugged her. "Mother, thank you for trusting me." I've always trusted you, Catherine replied. It's the world I don't trust, but looking at you two together, for the first time in a long time, I feel that you're really safe. That night, after Catherine left, Edward and Autumn walked through the vineyards under the moonlight. There was a new intimacy between them, a closeness that came from the public commitment they had made. Edward, Autumn said as they walked hand in hand, can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Of course. When I was little, I used to dream about a man who would save me. Not a prince on a white horse, but someone kind, someone who would really see me, who would love me not despite my flaws, but including them. Edward stopped walking and turned to her. Autumn, I never thought that man really existed. I thought they were just a girl's dreams. But then you appeared in the forest that night, and I knew it was you. Edward pulled her into his arms, feeling the weight of the responsibility and the privilege of being loved by someone like her. I'll try to be worthy of those dreams, he whispered against her hair. You already are, she replied. You always have been. They remained embraced under the stars, two hearts that had found their home in each other, ready to face any storm that the future might bring. 6 months later, Autumn had established herself in Edward's mansion as if she had always belonged to that place. She had transformed one of the rooms into a study office, where she spent her mornings preparing for the Literature College entrance exam, dreaming of a career that would combine her passion for the written word with her life experience. Edward had hired the best private tutors that money could buy, not out of ostentation, but because he wanted to give Autumn all the opportunities she deserved. The routine they developed was simple and rewarding. Autumn studied in the morning. While Edward took care of the vines, they had lunch together on the porch with a view of the mountains, spent the afternoons exploring the neighboring properties or simply talking in the library, and had dinner by candlelight, like two lovers who had all the time in the world. Edward discovered that living with Autumn was like rediscovering his own home. She brought music to the silent rooms, flowers to the empty tables, laughter to corridors that for years had only echoed his own lonely footsteps. More importantly, she brought a peace that he didn't know was possible, the peace of being loved without reservations, without fear, without the shadow of future losses. Autumn, in turn, flourished under Edward's care in a way that surprised even Catherine. The shy and wounded young woman that Jason had tried to break was transforming into a confident, intelligent woman passionate about life. Edward never tried to mold her or control her. Instead, he offered fertile soil where she could grow freely. But not everything was perfect. There were moments when the age difference was acutely felt. Edward sometimes caught himself censoring his own youthful impulses, worried about appearing ridiculous. Autumn occasionally felt intimidated by his life experience, questioning if her opinions were valid in the face of someone who had lived so much. These tensions came to the surface one night in September, when Autumn returned from a graduation party of a former schoolmate. She had gone alone, insisting that Edward didn't need to accompany her, but when she returned there was something different in her expression. "How was it?" Edward asked, rising from the armchair where he was reading. Autumn took off her shoes and threw herself on the couch with a sigh that sounded more tired than it should after a few hours of partying. "It was enlightening," she said finally. Edward approached, sitting beside her. "What happened?" Autumn was silent for a moment, as if organizing her thoughts. "I saw my former colleagues, Edward. I saw how young they are, how they have fun with simple things, how they talk about plans that seem light, without weight." Edward felt a chill in his stomach. And I realized that I couldn't relate to that. When they talked about parties, about adventures, about trying new things, I felt as if I were observing from outside, as if I were older than them. Edward stood up and walked to the window, trying to process what she was saying. "Autumn, are you telling me that you regret the choices you made?" "No," she replied quickly. "It's not regret, it's just sometimes I wonder who I would be if I had had a normal youth, if I had dated other boys, if I had made typical mistakes of my age, if I had had time to discover who I am independently of any man." The words cut Edward like knives. He turned to face her, seeing the genuine confusion in her eyes. "Do you want to discover these things?" he asked, his voice calmer than he felt. Autumn stood up and went to him. "Edward, I love you. That has never changed, nor will it change. But sometimes I feel as if I had skipped important stages of my life, as if I had gone straight from adolescence to something that seems like marriage." Edward nodded slowly. He had feared this moment since the beginning of the relationship, the possibility that Autumn would one day realize what she had sacrificed to be with him. "What do you want to do?" he asked. Autumn touched his face tenderly. "I want to experience some things. I want to go out with people my age sometimes. I want to go to parties, travel with friends, maybe even date other people." The last sentence was said in a whisper, but Edward heard it clearly. He closed his eyes, feeling a familiar pain settle in his chest. "For how long?" he asked. "I don't know," Autumn admitted. "Maybe a few months, maybe more. I just know that I need to be sure that I chose you because it's really what I want, not because you saved me when I was broken." Edward nodded again, understanding her logic even though it almost killed him. "And if you discover that what you want is something different, if you discover that you prefer a life more appropriate to your age?" Autumn began to cry silently. "Then I'll have to follow that path, and you'll have to let me go." Edward pulled her into his arms, feeling her tears wet his shirt. "Autumn, you're right, you need to be sure. And I need to know that if you come back to me, it will be because you want to be here, not because you feel obligated." They spent the night talking, planning how this temporary separation would be. Autumn would return to Catherine's house, continue studying, explore relationships with people her age. Edward would completely respect her decision, without interfering, without pressuring, without trying to influence her in any way. "But Edward," Autumn said when it was almost dawn, "I need you to know something, even if I choose to explore other options, even if I need time. What I feel for you is not gratitude, it's not dependence, it's real, true love, the kind that changes a person forever." Edward kissed her softly. "I know, and that's why I'm letting you go." The farewell happened. On an autumn morning, with the leaves of the vines beginning to turn golden, Autumn packed her bags with the same silent determination that characterized her, while Edward watched, trying to memorize every moment. "How long do you think you'll need?" he asked when she was putting the last suitcase in the car. 6 months, she said. "Give me 6 months if I don't know what I want by then." "Then we'll talk again," Edward completed. Autumn approached him one last time. "Edward, I want you to know that these have been the happiest months of my life. Regardless of what happens, that will never change." Edward kissed her, a long and desperate kiss that carried all the love and all the longing he was already feeling. "I love you," he said when they separated. "And because I love you, I'm leaving you free to discover if you really love me too." Autumn got into the car and left, leaving Edward alone at the entrance of his property, watching until she disappeared around the bend in the road. The months that followed were the hardest that Edward had faced since the death of Helen and Isabella. But this time, it was different. He wasn't grieving a definitive loss, but suspended in an uncertainty that was almost worse. He knew that Autumn was alive, was well, was exploring a life without him, and didn't know if she would return. Edward tried to maintain his normal routine, but everything reminded him of Autumn. The table where they had lunch, the library where she studied, the porch where they watched the sunset. He found himself counting the days, then the weeks, then the months. During this time, he occasionally received news of Autumn through Catherine, who visited the vineyard now and then to check how he was doing. Autumn had started college, was doing well with her studies, had made new friends. She was, according to her mother, discovering who she is when she's not taking care of other people. Edward tried to be happy for her, but each piece of news was a stab in his heart, especially when Catherine mentioned almost casually that Autumn was seeing a college boy. Nothing serious, Catherine hastened to add upon seeing the expression on Edward's face. Just experimenting. Edward nodded, forcing a smile. It's good that she's exploring her options. But that night he drank more wine than he should, and stayed awake until very late, looking at the stars and wondering if he had made the biggest mistake of his life by letting autumn go. The 5th month was the hardest. Edward began to accept the real possibility that autumn wouldn't return, that she had found a life that better suited her age and her needs. He began to psychologically prepare himself to live the rest of his life with the memories of those perfect months, grateful for having experienced that love, even if briefly. It was then that one afternoon, at the beginning of the 6th month, he heard the familiar sound of a car coming up the dirt road toward the house. Edward was in the wine cellar, checking a batch of Cabernet Sauvignon that was almost ready, when the sound made him stop everything he was doing. He climbed slowly, his heart beating so hard that he could hear it. When he reached the porch, he saw Autumn getting out of the car, more beautiful than ever. She had let her hair grow, was wearing clothes he didn't recognize, and there was something different in her posture, a new confidence, a certainty that wasn't there before. They looked at each other for a long moment, separated by a few meters that seemed like miles. "Hello, Edward," she finally said. "Hello, Autumn," he replied, unable to move. Autumn took a few steps toward him, and Edward saw tears shining in her eyes. "I missed you," she said simply. "I missed you too," Edward replied. Autumn stopped a few steps from him. "Edward, I need to tell you about these months." Edward nodded, preparing himself to hear about the life she had built without him, about the boy Catherine had mentioned, about all the things she had discovered about herself. "I did everything I said I would do," Autumn began. "I made new friends, went to parties, traveled, studied, and yes, I dated other people." Edward closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the pain. "But Edward," Autumn continued, her voice becoming firmer, "each party made me realize how I prefer our conversations on the porch. Each trip made me think about how I would like to explore it with you. And each person I met made me realize that you're not just the man who saved me, you're the man I choose every day to love." Edward opened his eyes, seeing something new in Autumn's face, not the wounded young woman he had found in the forest, nor the uncertain girl who had left 6 months before, but a woman who knew exactly what she wanted. "Autumn," he began. "Let me finish," she interrupted him. "I discovered that I can be young, I can have fun, I can experience new things, but I also discovered that none of that has meaning if I can't share it with you. I discovered that love has no age, Edward. It has depth, and what I feel for you is deeper than anything I experienced in these months." Edward took a step toward her. "Are you sure, absolutely sure?" Autumn smiled, the radiant smile that he had loved since the first day. "I'm sure that I want to spend the rest of my life learning to love you better every day. I'm sure that I want to grow old by your side, create memories with you, build a future that is ours." Edward finally moved, closing the distance between them and pulling her into his arms. "Autumn, these were the longest 6 months of my life." "For me, too," she whispered against his chest, "but they were worth it. Because now I know without a shadow of doubt that you are my choice, not by circumstance, not by necessity, but by pure and simple love." Edward moved her away slightly to look into her eyes. "And the boy you were dating?" Autumn laughed softly. "Paul is a sweetheart. Intelligent, handsome, my age. Everything I should theoretically want. But when he kissed me, I closed my eyes and thought of you. When he talked about the future, I imagined a different future. He deserves someone who loves him completely, and that someone isn't me." Edward kissed her then, a kiss that carried 6 months of longing, of uncertainty, of hope maintained against all odds. When they separated, both were crying with relief and happiness. "Welcome home," Edward whispered. "It's good to be home," Autumn replied. And at that moment both knew that they had found not just love, but the absolute certainty that it was a love that would last forever. A year after Autumn's return, Edward proposed to her on a spring morning, when the vines were flowering and the air smelled of new promises. He didn't kneel dramatically, nor make grand speeches. He simply handed her a simple and elegant ring during breakfast and said, "Autumn, Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The ring had belonged to Edward's grandmother, a woman he had always described as strong and independent, who had managed the vineyard with her husband at a time when that was almost unthinkable. Autumn put it on her finger with tears in her eyes, knowing that she was receiving not just a marriage proposal, but complete acceptance into the Blackwood family. The wedding was held at the vineyard itself, in a simple but elegant ceremony that gathered the people who really mattered. Catherine cried throughout the celebration, alternating between tears of happiness at seeing her daughter so radiant and tears of longing at realizing that her little girl had become a woman. Edward had hired a small orchestra that played from classical music to some songs that made Autumn laugh, and the party extended into the night under the stars. Jason Fisher didn't appear, of course. He had left Pinecrest a few months after the scandal, transferring to a university in New York where no one knew his story. Robert Fisher sent a wedding gift, a box of expensive wines accompanied by a card that simply said, "I wish happiness," to the couple, a gesture that Edward interpreted as a silent request for forgiveness for his son's mistakes. The honeymoon was spent on the property itself. Edward had suggested trips to Europe, to famous vineyards in France or Italy, but Autumn had preferred to stay at home. "Our paradise is here," she said, gesturing to the vines that extended as far as the eye could see. "Why look for beauty in other places when we have everything we need right here?" They spent 2 weeks rediscovering each other as husband and wife, walking through the vines hand in hand, cooking together in the mansion's large kitchen, making love with a passion that combined the urgency of youth with the depth of emotional maturity. Edward discovered that Autumn had become even more beautiful, if that was possible. Not just physically, but with an internal luminosity that came from the absolute certainty of being exactly where she should be. Autumn, in turn, marveled at the way Edward had transformed since they met. The somber and reclusive man she had found in the forest had given way to someone who laughed easily, who made plans for the future, who woke up every day with renewed energy. She knew that part of this transformation was her work, but Edward had also found his own strength, his own capacity to be happy again. The first years of marriage brought challenges that they faced together. Autumn graduated in literature with honors, writing a thesis on narratives of female overcoming that impressed both her professors and Edward. She began to write her own short stories, stories that talked about women who found strength in unexpected places, who learned to love and be loved despite past traumas. Edward, inspired by his wife's creativity, decided to expand the vineyard, to include gastronomic and literary experiences. They created an annual festival that combined wine tasting with poetry and prose readings, transforming the property into a cultural destination that attracted visitors from all over the country. But it was when Autumn was 25 that life presented them with their biggest surprise. She had been feeling unwell for a few weeks, more tired than normal, when Catherine discreetly suggested that she take a pregnancy test. Autumn looked at the positive result with a mixture of shock and joy that left her speechless. She and Edward had talked about children, but always abstractly, as something that might happen in the future. The reality of a pregnancy was both terrifying and wonderful. Edward was in the wine cellar when she found him, holding the test in trembling hands. He looked at the small plastic object for a long moment before understanding what he was seeing. "Autumn," he whispered, "does this mean that we're going to be parents?" She completed, her voice choked with emotion. Edward pulled her into his arms, feeling a joy so intense that it almost knocked him down. But along with the happiness came fear, the fear that history would repeat itself, that he would again lose those he loved. Autumn felt the tension in his muscles and moved away to look into his eyes. "Edward, what are you thinking?" He hesitated, not wanting to contaminate this moment with his fears, but Autumn knew him too well to accept evasions. "You're afraid," she said softly, "afraid that it will happen again." Edward nodded, unable to lie to her. "Autumn, I don't know if I can go through that again. If I lose you, if I lose our child?" Autumn placed her hands on his face, forcing him to look into her eyes. Edward, listen to me. We're not going to live in fear of what might happen. We're going to live in gratitude for what we have now. For the baby growing inside me. For the love we share. For each day we have together. But what if? No what ifs. Autumn interrupted him firmly. Edward, you taught me that some of the best things in life are born from the worst circumstances. Our daughter, because I'm sure it's a girl, will be proof of that. She will be born from the love that grew from our wounds, from the strength we found in each other. Edward kissed her then, a kiss full of gratitude and determination. Our daughter, he repeated, trying out the words. How do you know it's a girl? Autumn smiled mysteriously. Maternal instinct. Autumn's pregnancy was carefully monitored by the best doctors money could buy, but she insisted on living normally, continuing to write, helping with the vineyard's administration, refusing to be treated as if she were made of crystal. Edward, in turn, oscillated between excessive protection and the determination to trust in the natural process of life. Isabella Sophia Blackwood was born on a clear September morning, weighing 7 pounds of pure perfection. Edward cried when he held her for the first time, seeing in that small face a perfect mixture of Autumn and himself, but primarily seeing a new chance to love without fear. Autumn observed Edward cradling their daughter with a delicacy that contrasted with his, large hands calloused from work in the vines. She has your eyes, she said softly. And your smile, Edward replied, noticing how the baby seemed to smile even while sleeping. Catherine, who had moved to the property during the last months of the pregnancy to help with the preparations, observed the scene with tears of happiness. Her daughter had become a complete woman, fulfilled, loved. And Edward had become the son-in-law she had never dreamed of having, a man who loved Autumn not just as a wife, but as a companion, partner, equal. The first months with Isabella brought a new dynamic to the house. Edward revealed himself to be a dedicated father, waking up for night feedings, changing diapers with the same precision he applied to the production of his wines, singing lullabies with a low and melodious voice that made the baby fall asleep instantly. Autumn flourished in motherhood, discovering a strength and patience that she didn't know she possessed. She continued writing, but now her stories talked about the miracle of new life, about how love could multiply infinitely without ever diminishing. One afternoon, when Isabella was 6 months old and sleeping peacefully in her crib, Edward found Autumn on the porch, looking at the vines that were being prepared for harvest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, sitting beside her. "I'm thinking about how everything changed," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "A few years ago, I was a broken girl you found in the forest. Now I'm a mother, wife, writer. I'm complete." Edward kissed the top of her head. "You were always complete, Autumn. I just had the luck to be present when you discovered that." "And you?" she asked. "How do you feel now?" Edward was silent for a moment, thinking. "I feel reborn, as if my real life had begun the day I found you. Isabella, my daughter who left, will always have a place in my heart. But Isabella, our daughter, taught me that the heart can love infinitely, without limits, without fear, that one love will diminish another." Autumn turned to kiss him. "I love you, Edward Blackwood. I love you for saving me, for letting me go when I needed to, for accepting me back, for giving me a family. And I love you, Autumn Blackwood, for teaching me that it's never too late to start over, to love again, to be happy." The sound of Isabella's soft cry interrupted them, and both smiled. "I think our princess has woken up," Autumn said, standing up. "I'll get her," Edward offered, but Autumn shook her head. "Let's go together," she said. "We're a family now. We do everything together." They walked hand in hand toward the baby's room, where Isabella awaited them with her bright blue eyes and a smile that promised she would be as stubborn as her mother and as determined as her father. 5 years later, Isabella ran among the vines like a little savage, her golden hair flying in the wind, chasing butterflies and inventing stories about fairies that lived in the grapes. Autumn watched her from the porch, one hand resting on her belly where her second child was growing, a boy this time, whom they had decided to call Benjamin. Edward approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her and placing his hands over hers, feeling the soft movements of the baby. "Any regrets?" he asked, a question that had become a loving joke between them. "None," Autumn replied without hesitation. "And you?" "None," he echoed. "Just gratitude." They remained like that, watching Isabella play among the vines that had become the setting of their unlikely but absolutely perfect love story. Autumn had found her strength, Edward had found his second chance, and together they had built a family that was proof that true love knows no age, circumstances, or social expectations. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with shades of gold and crimson, Isabella ran toward her parents, throwing herself into Edward's arms with a crystalline laugh. "Daddy, Mommy, I saw a fairy in the grapes," she announced with absolute seriousness. "Really?" Autumn asked, kneeling to be at her daughter's height. "And what did she say?" Isabella thought for a moment, then whispered conspiratorially, "She said our family is magical." Edward and Autumn exchanged a look over their daughter's head, both thinking the same thing. The fairy was right. Their family was magical, not because it had been easy to build, but because it had been born from the transformation of two wounded people into something greater, stronger, more beautiful than either of them could have imagined alone. That night, after Isabella went to bed and Autumn fell asleep beside him with a protective hand over her belly, Edward stayed awake for a few minutes, looking out the window at the vines illuminated by the moon. He thought of Helen and Isabella, his first family, and sent a silent prayer of gratitude for them having been part of his life, for having prepared him to love again when the right time came. Then he thought of Autumn, of the wounded young woman he had found in the forest, and of the strong and radiant woman who slept beside him. He thought of Isabella, his small daughter full of life, and of Benjamin, who would soon arrive to complete his family. And finally, Edward smiled and allowed himself to completely believe in a truth that had taken years to accept. Some love. Stories really do have happy endings, especially those that begin in the most unlikely places and are built with patience, respect, and the courage to love without reservations. Blackwood Vineyards would continue producing its special wines, born from family tradition and passion for the land. Autumn would continue writing her stories about overcoming and hope. Isabella would grow among the vines, learning about love, work, and fulfilled dreams. And Benjamin would soon arrive to add his own magic to that family that had become living proof that true love can flourish at any age, in any circumstance, when it finds the right heart to nurture it. And so, under the starry sky of Pine Crest, surrounded by the perfume of the ripe vines and the soft sound of the wind in the leaves, Edward and Autumn slept embraced, secure in the certainty that they had found not just love, but the kind of happiness that lasts forever, that which is built day by day, choice after choice, kiss after kiss, in an eternal dance between two souls that decided to write their story together.